Here we are, folks. So, how's it going? Louder. How is it going? Okay, thanks. Are you awake? Good. I'm not sure, but I still have to entertain you for the next 90 minutes, so I will do my best, okay? So, any questions, comments, thoughts, critiques of any kind about what we said yesterday, what we discussed yesterday? Was it all crystal clear 100%? Even after being a very clever student, listening to the recording yesterday evening, of course, because we had very, very, very little things to do, other things to do. All good? Okay, cool. Let me put this thing where it's supposed to be. Okay. Okay. Then, if everything is crystal clear, we will see in a moment, because I have some recapping questions from yesterday. Of course. And on top of that, we're going to talk about a slightly connected but different issue today, which is Brexit. What is happening with our dear UK friends? Any UK people in this room? Anybody from the UK? No? No? Not really? Interesting. Okay. Our UK friends, the big island on the other side of the channel, they decided to leave the European Union around 10 years ago. Yes, 10 years have already passed. Crazy. Crazy. And, of course, we will connect the two items, the two topics, by talking about how not only the UK and the EU handle Brexit, but also how the UK and the EU handle trade relationships. And this is our liaise here. And hopefully this will be a good segue also looking into next week's lectures, I think, by Zamira next week, who I think is going to talk a bit about Brexit and enlargement, right? So hopefully there is a red thread here. Huh? I feel rouge. Huh? Okay. Okay. Now, as I said, the menu for today it will look pretty much like this. So more recap from yesterday. Then a bit of a background about the Brexit deal. How did that happen? And what did it mean for European integration? And then a kind of a deep dive on the trade relationship between the UK and the EU after breakfast. After Brexit. And of course, the more sort of detailed account of that through the existing trade agreement, because of course, the EU likes to negotiate trade agreements. We saw it yesterday. So of course, there is a trade agreement between the EU and the UK. So just to give you a primer a bit about the situation that is going on out there. Of course, 10 years have passed, but there's always something new about the UK and the EU, especially about the UK. The UK is pretty much messed up in the last few years, I would say. UK politics are so funny to watch, honestly. I mean, I'm Italian. We used to have like one government every year, you know. We are famous for that. We like to make up a government, go to vote, and then take down that government and go for another round of votes. And now our government is like the same for like 5 years, and then the UK has changed like 5 governments in 6 years. I'm like, what's going on, man? I mean, it's crazy. Maybe there's something to do with the fact that you decided to leave the European Union, maybe. Or maybe it has to do with the fact that you have poor politicians, maybe. Any case. So recapping about Monday, I want to hear from you. So to see where we stand. Kind of slightly legalistic questions there. First question, recap. I'm not going forward until someone answers, so, you know, you don't get the juicy stuff until you get through this stuff. That's how it goes in life. The juicy stuff only comes after the hard stuff. So question. Is international trade an exclusive competence of the EU under the common commercial policy? Question mark? It's kind of a yes or no question. Anybody? Anybody? Yep. Yes, it is. International trade is, legally speaking, an exclusive competence that is exercised by the European Union, and the framework under which this happens is called common commercial policy under the European treaties. We have mentioned some articles, 207 TFEU, 216 TFEU, and so on and so forth. Okay, great. You see, it's getting smoothly. Let's see the second one. Are member states' parliaments involved in the process of conclusion of EU free trade agreements? Yes or no? Or maybe, depends. Lawyers like depends as an answer. That's a great answer. Yep. No, but is it a 100% no? But sometimes yes, okay. It's about exclusive versus shared competencies, okay? So in some, we just said that international trade is an exclusive competence of the European Union, okay? So free trade agreements are negotiated by the Commission only, not by Germany, not by France, no? Deal with Europe, deal with Europe. Remember that one, okay? So only Europe, but depends on which agreements we're talking about. There could be situations where trade agreements must be also ratified by national parliaments. And this is the case most likely for the EU-Mercosur agreement. That was the case for the CETA agreement. Why? Because these agreements are called mixed agreements. They are mixed agreements, which means that they cover issues that are both under the exclusive competence of the European Union. So, for example, removing barriers to trade, removing custom duties, this kind of stuff, tariffs, this kind of stuff. But also, they cover issues, topics that are of shared competence, like, for example, environmental protection, I don't know, social rights, stuff like that, okay? So there could be a scenario where member states' parliaments are indeed involved. Last one, which is not a yes or no, actually, but maybe you can guess. Does the EU like mixed agreements? Shake it, shake it, shake it. Yep.
No, because it makes it much more difficult for them to conclude agreements.
No, they don't like them. Yeah, true. In principle, they don't like them. They use them, but they don't like them. Because again, as your colleague brilliantly said, that involves 27 plus other 3 or 4 in Belgium. So, all that's 30 parliaments being involved in this process. So what the EU is doing, what it's trying to do, has tried to do many times, is doing already with the Mercosur agreement now, is to circumvent this somehow, prompting some legal techniques around this, sort of covering this mixity. And we have seen yesterday that this leads to tension. Tension between the European Union as a whole and the member states, for example, France against the EU-Mercosur agreement. But also, importantly, interinstitutional tension in the European Union. What happened with the Mercosur agreement? Last news I gave you yesterday. If you remember, yeah. Yes, correct. The European Parliament took the agreement and shipped it to the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, okay? Because they want the Court of Justice to look into this and to see if the European Commission and the Council have operated correctly. Or are they circumventing national parliaments? Are they circumventing, democratically elected bodies in the way they're operating? So, indeed, the EU does not really like mixed agreements because that makes things more complicated. But sometimes they have to do it because it's just a matter of competence, right? But again, it's like, it's an asset, but not a must-have. If they can avoid it, they will try to avoid it. Because they want to speed up things, especially now, to put things in the current situation. The EU needs these agreements to take off as soon as possible. They cannot wait for 27 parliaments to wake up and say, I don't like this provision on agricultural stuff, or we don't like this provision on pesticides, on X and Y and Z, because they need to seal these deals quickly, right? This is the sentiment. This is the political sentiment, okay? And this is also for you to place it in the broader context. This is the general sentiment in the EU right now, okay? The sentiment is that, the political sentiment is that things must happen more efficiently, more quickly, so that we are more competitive and we can stand, we can stand a game internationally. And this applies to EU regulations. Have you heard maybe of the Omnibus package? If you haven't, check it out, because I think you should. And this is all about streamlining, simplifying, fast-tracking. You choose the buzzword. It's about simplifying things, putting things through. Same with trade agreements. The last one I heard on this note is that trade agreements now are going to be provisionally enforced and applied in English, only in English, without waiting for the translation in all the other European languages. Because normally all the acts of the European Union are translated in all the languages of the EU, right? Funnily enough, English is not necessarily an official language of the European Union, because the UK left, right? But every act must be translated into all the languages of the European Union. This, for an agreement that is 200 pages long, might take a while, okay? And the Commission is like, we cannot wait for these translators, well-paid translators, to come up with that shit. No. We go for the English version, you sit with the English version, and then when the other comes, we will be happy anyway, okay? So this is the sentiment, just pushing things through, which can be good or can be bad. But this is a situation where we sit right now, and this is why the EU does not necessarily like mixed agreements. This is just a recap from yesterday, stuff that is there that you can check out if you're getting nerdy about the law. So the legal grounds for what we just said, shared competence versus exclusive competence. We also said in general, and as a kind of small like crystal ball exercise, that the CJEU, if it will follow the sort of precedent that is set on the EU-Singapore agreement 10 years ago, would probably interpret many of the provisions of the EU-Mercosur agreement as covering trade issues, and therefore putting those provisions as exclusive competence of the European Union. Because you can play this trick. And if you check these slides at home, with some time, and you skim through the lines, you will see that the argument that the court makes, in many instances, is really to say, basically, everything is trade. So, many things, including labor standards, environmental standards, that would not be, let's say, obviously considered matters of trade, they can be interpreted as matters of trade, and therefore matters that are fully under the exclusive competence of the European Union. This is a legal interpretation technique. We will see what the court will do. The EU-Mercosur agreement is a very politically charged file, so it's not very easy also to take a decision on that. But the funny thing is that the court does not deliver a judgment here. It delivers an opinion. So say, this is what we think about it. Then you deal with it. So we will see what the court will say. It will take some weeks or months. But my bet is that they will probably operate in this way, right? Whether then national parliaments, member states will be happy with this, or the European Parliament will be happy with this, we shall see, okay? Which is a great way to end the first segment. We shall see. Questions about this? Comments? No? Okay. So, let's try to wake up and talk about Brexit, yeah? You know this guy? Name, full name? Nigel Farage. Who is Nigel Farage? Another idiot, for my opinion, but more professionally speaking, who is?
I'll try to be professional. He's the leader of currently the Reform Party, formerly of the UKIP party.
Yeah. And what does
United Kingdom Independent Party.
what independent from what?
From the EU.
From the EU, because they are just pretty independent already from by themselves, you know. I mean, they've been one of the largest empires in the world, you know. I think they are pretty independent, right? But they want to be independent anyway from the UK, from the EU, okay? Thanks. What did this guy? What is the guy on the left side? Who is the guy on the left side? The hammer guy. Say again?
No, it's Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson, yeah. And who is Boris Johnson? Former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Yep. Strong supporter of the Brexit campaign. Both of them. Okay? Both supporters of the Brexit campaign. I think you have all seen the picture on the right-hand side. Right? What does this picture represent? Yep. Yeah. Whereas we have blue and yellow. What does the yellow heat map stand for? You have 50-50, so. Should I stay or should I stay or no? Stay. Yellow is stay. The areas that are dotted in yellow are the areas where most of the people voted for the stay in the EU, right? Stay in the EU. The blue areas are the ones that ended up voting as a majority, of course, not all the people, but the majority voted for leaving the EU. Okay? This has become quite famous because the judgment call there, I mean the outcome of the referendum that was carried out in the UK on the push of these guys by Prime Minister was Peter Cameron, I think, one of the dumbest politicians of the last 50 years, I think. I mean, no offense. Still not easy to get to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, I understand, but that was a dumb-ass move. In any case, referendum was very close, 52%, 52 to 48, I think, something like that. Very, very close. But you can see, what does this, by the way, this chart, this picture tell you? If you think about geography for a moment. Which area is the yellow there? Come on, UK geography. Oh, okay, thank you. London. What is the area on the left side there? No, forget about the island. I mean the small island, the big island. Wales. What is the area all the way up? Say again. Scotland, yeah. Scotland. And then we go to the small island, which is a fraction of the island, of course. What is the fraction of the island that we see on the other side? Northern Ireland. Also a big split up. Basically between, I think, is Belfast, right? And the rest of Northern Ireland. So basically this tells you that we have an extremely polarized vote here, right? We have one country, country, part of the UK, Scotland, that definitely wanted to stay in the EU. We have a large part of Northern Ireland that wanted to stay in the EU, and we have, of course, certain parts of England that really wanted to stay in the EU versus certain areas of the UK that really wanted to leave, or at least they thought so in the first place, because these guys have been very good at pulling out some, propaganda bullshit. So, in any case, this is what happened. I had a couple of videos to recap, because it has been already 10 years ago. So, it's also to put it a bit into context, how did this happen, what followed, what was the immediate reaction to it, from the UK side and also from the EU side, of course. Yes, this guy is coming up later. History Channel, neutral, right?
The UK voted.
And actually, now that I look at him, he looks smarter than I think, in any way. David, not Peter, sorry. So that's the story. I mean, this video, which is pretty neutral, tells you that the UK has never been a great neighbor or a great member in the EU, in the sense that it's never been greatly in favor of European integration. I can say this, you can take for my words, but honestly, my understanding of the UK relationship with the EU was a very opportunistic one. We are in as long as it's good for us, we are out as long as it's not good for us, right? And also this kind of political, historical recap kind of gives you the sense of it, right? If you put into this mix also the schizophrenic UK politics, boom, you have what happened 10 years ago. You put it a bit of financial crisis as well, of course, immigration, right? UK people's first, these people are stealing our jobs, this kind of stuff. Plus the bonkers campaign about the standardization of the EU, right? The EU is creeping on every single aspect of our life. You know, it's telling us how our sockets will look like, how our appliances will look like, how our jackets will look like. This was the campaign that was launched by UKIP, basically, saying that EU law is going to take away every kind of sovereignty over our own daily lives by means of standardization, essentially, by means of uniformation of the law, because that's what the EU law does. So this is more or less the perception. Now, what was the reaction to this? Wall Street Journal.
UK's decision to leave the European Union.
I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
Attention turned to what happens next, particularly in the rest of Europe.
Was die Folgen dieses Einschnitts in den nächsten Tagen, Wochen, Monaten und Jahren genau bedeuten werden, das wird jetzt ganz entscheidend davon abhängen, ob wir, die anderen 27 Mitgliedstaaten der Europäischen Union, und uns als willens- und fähig erweisen werden, in dieser Situation keine schnellen und einfachen Schlüsse aus dem Referendum in Großbritannien zu ziehen, die Europa nur weiter spalten würden.
The remaining 27 EU leaders will meet next week without Mr. Cameron.
Today, on behalf of the 27 leaders, I can say that we are determined to keep our unity as 27. For all of us, the Union is the framework for our common future. I would also like to reassure you that there will be no legal vacuum. Until the United Kingdom formally leaves the European Union, EU law will continue to apply to and within the UK.
German Finance Minister Wolfgang Schäuble said he was in touch with his colleagues from the group of 7 industrialized nations on Friday over the UK's decision to leave the European Union. Others in Europe applauded the outcome.
This means that the UK has voted to leave the European Union.
Geert Wilders, the leader of the anti-immigrants, anti-Europe Dutch Freedom Party, welcomed the UK result in a tweet, while France's Eurosceptic National Front leader Marine Le Pen called the result a historic moment and said France should also have a referendum.
Ce référendum sur l'appartenance de la France à l'Union européenne est une nécessité démocratique. Les Français doivent pouvoir choisir eux aussi cette voie de liberté qui rendra à la France sa pleine et entière souveraineté.
But back in the UK, attention was focused on former London Mayor Boris Johnson and the Leave Vote campaigner.
I want to reassure everybody that, in my view, as a result of this, Britain will continue to be a great European power, leading discussions on foreign policy and defence and intelligence sharing and all the work that currently goes on to make our world safer.
He is seen as one of the frontrunners to replace Mr. Cameron, who had earlier announced that he will step down in the fall.
That the majority of the people voting have voted no to the referendum question.
The decision to leave has also raised the prospect of another Scottish independence referendum, following its unsuccessful 2014 vote to leave the UK.
The Scottish Parliament should have the right to hold another referendum if there is a significant and material change in the circumstances that prevailed in 2014, such as Scotland being taken out of the EU against our will. Scotland does now face that prospect. It is a significant and material change in circumstances, and it is therefore a statement of the obvious that the option of a second referendum must be on the table, and it is on the table.
For now, the UK's decision will trigger a series of meetings in coming days across European capitals as policymakers seek to send out a message that business will continue and the bloc will overcome the crisis.
Okay. So this is quite a drawback, right? I mean, we're seeing many faces that are not around anymore. François Hollande, Angela Merkel, you know, these kind of people that have been quite influential in the past. So can anybody tell me what is the vibe that this video, especially the second video, gives you? Also the first one, I guess. What is the... If you have to take away one message or two from both videos. No clear answer here, just your thoughts. Anybody has a buzzer for me? Yeah. Skepticism, yeah. Good. Skepticism, of course, towards, not very clear towards what? Towards European integration, I guess. Towards integrating the UK over there, yes? Chaos? Yeah, it was chaos. The first weeks there was chaos, of course. Not that the UK is in a more stable situation now, but there was chaos, of course, chaos within the UK, chaos within the EU. Political chaos, the market went berserker, you know, all this kind of stuff.
I'd say that political populism in this case showed how simplification does not work.
Okay.
You vote to leave European Union, but the day after you leave, you're still inside the European Union, and the process was still very long. So I'd say
populism is bad, right? Do you agree? Populism is bad. Of course, there is a wage degree of populism here. I mean, the campaign was like, okay, you vote. If we leave, the day after, everything will be different. Forget about that. Now I have tons of slides about how that was not the case, right? But of course, the people bought the message that, okay, we vote, and then, magically, all the immigrants, will be swept away, and we will get tons of jobs. Everybody will get rich. We will get rid of all the EU bullshit, everything will happen overnight. Not the case. And if you can see that the approach that the EU was taking in the very first place was a very firm one. We are not going to let the UK play its game as it wants. EU will keep applying until we will find, an agreeable and, comfortable solution for everybody, right? It's not that, the EU is kind of a toy that you can just mess around with and then you can throw away once you're tired with it, right? It's not like, the Toy Story story, right? You cannot do that, right? That's the approach that Donald Tusk, currently Prime Minister of Poland, I think, back in the days, representing the European Union in the European Council, was putting on the table. On the other hand, we have a lot of arguments for sovereignty, right? I mean, we have a lot of arguments from Scotland, and we have a lot of arguments from the UK as well, from the leaving people, about retaining sovereignty. This is a message that I want to give to you. Again, I think I mentioned it yesterday. I think when we talk about integration, disintegration, the European project, at least from a lawyer's perspective, you really have to think about the issue of sovereignty. It's very interesting to look at political, legal developments through the prism, through the lenses of sovereignty. Because the EU, again, has been created only because states have decided to transfer sovereignty to the European Union. So there is this kind of delegation of sovereignty that is happening from every single state, including the UK in the past, to the European Union, to this new entity. This is how the EU exists. This is how the EU survives. And this is always an issue of tension. This is always an issue of tension. You can see it in all the sensitive files. Migration. Oh, no. You're not going to tell us in Brussels how we're going to deal with migrants, because this is not a matter that, this is sovereign matters. We deal with migrants as we see fit. You don't do this kind of allocation plans and, 100 here, 100 there. No. This is our sovereign prerogative. Don't mess around with that, right? We see this also somehow with money, budgets. We had that discussion in the past. We see it over and over again. Okay? So this is something for you to take away beyond this slide deck of mine. Okay? Good. Questions or thoughts? We good? Okay. What time is it? Time for one last video. Because I really like this. I really like this one. So it's so who took over after David Cameron? Yep. So, here we go, in the bombastic...
Thoughtful, though at times perhaps a little intimidating. Peering down at Theresa May were grand figures from the ancient world, a reminder, if one were needed, that the stakes are high. Today, Theresa May set out her vision for the UK's future relationship with the EU at the Mansion House in the City of London. Criticised for indulging Brexit supporters, the Prime Minister issued a warning that they may not be entirely happy.
I want to be straight with people, because the reality is that we all need to face up to some hard facts. We're leaving the single market. Life is going to be different. In certain ways, our access to each other's markets will be less than it is now. How could the EU's structure of rights and obligations be sustained if the UK or any country were allowed to enjoy all the benefits without all of the obligations?
So a warm reception there for Theresa May from the city elite, who've just sat through a speech which did mark a marked change in tone from the Prime Minister. For months, she's tiptoed around Brexit supporters, gently suggesting there will be challenges they will need to accept over Brexit. But today, she set out what she described as a series of hard facts they will have to accept as she negotiates Britain's exit from the EU.
Those hard facts about Brexit are: European law will still have an effect in the UK. Leaving the single market will have an impact on the economy. No take-it-or-leave-it approach on the Irish border, and making binding commitments to remain in step with the EU in some areas.
David Davis, can I ask you, are you going to have to use all your renowned skills as a diplomat to sell these hard facts to your fellow Brexit supporters?
No, I don't think so. I think the simple fact is, you go ask Boris, go ask the other Brexiteers in cabinet, if you like. But what the centre of this is that Parliament will always have a say. Today, the rules come down to the European Union. Parliament doesn't really have a proper say. This time, they'll have a say, and they'll make that say. They'll exercise that say in the knowledge of the consequences, one way or another. Will this give us access? Will it not give us access? And that's what a free country will do, and that's what will deliver the best outcome for Britain in the long run.
Lest any Brexit supporter fear that today marks betrayal, the Prime Minister warned the EU that it too needs to face up to hard facts. Her fundamental vision for Brexit also remains unchanged: out of the single market and customs union, and no direct say for the European Court of Justice over the UK. These are balanced by a call for the UK to forge the deepest possible partnership with the EU, possibly including associate membership of some of its regulatory bodies. Brexit supporters gave the speech a guarded welcome.
So Anne-Marie Trevelyan, can I ask you, if you were Prime Minister, is this the speech you would have given?
It was a very pragmatic speech. Would I have given this one? I'm not sure. I'm not in that position. I haven't had to plough through these, incredibly complex sort of, departmental de-wranglings to see where we sit and what it looks. But I think, yes, it was a very pragmatic speech talking to our European partners.
Remain supporters were unimpressed.
What strikes me is that we're almost 2 years on from the EU referendum and the Prime Minister is still trying to hammer out the details about what leaving the European Union actually means. And what struck me today was the focus wasn't on negotiations with the Commission, wasn't on getting the best deal, wasn't on protecting public services, but was trying to hold that fragile coalition together in the Conservative Party, which is being led around by the hard right.
Sparse. That has been the EU complaint until now about Britain's vision for its future relationship with Brussels. Today, Theresa May filled that space.
Fantastic. Right? Okay. So Theresa May, I think, was not necessarily in a great place to be, of course. She was the person that was carrying over the burden of what happened in 2016. And I think she made a very good and honest, pragmatic speech, saying there's going to be hard truth. This is not going to be easy, okay? And I think all the hard truths that were put in the video are very clear and explain what the problems were.
Therefore, we're discussing milk and whole milk and how good it is, how nourishing, and these people all come from
Somebody's watching
beautiful farms, have a wonderful life.
Is this David
They're happy
David
today
Cameron
that
watching
they
us?
would have been if we didn't sign this. So we'll be talking about that in a second. Will, can you read the first two items, and we're going to get going after that, and we'll be talking about a couple of things.
Okay, let's watch this.
Some news on Iran, which we're going to talk about.
Now it's 44 minutes. Okay, but just the title of Trump is restoring whole milk to school cafeterias is amazing. Okay, that's the world we live in, folks. Okay. Massive, right? Okay, good. So, I wanted to wrap up just to say that if Trump is okay with this, are you okay, Mr. Trump? Okay, no interferences now. So essentially, we have this tension, okay? And legally, what meant the Brexit referendum? It did mean that the EU became a separate legal order from the UK. Okay, so it meant that we are talking now about completely different legal orders. So the UK became just simply as any other third state, just like from the EU perspective, I mean, just like Brazil, just like Albania, just like Ukraine, just like the United States. Nothing different than that. And this provided for heavy political tensions. Because still, even after Brexit, I would say there has been this kind of attempt to do this, what I call here, cakeism, right? So have your piece of the cake, right? Have your cake, actually, eat it all, even in the future, right? Have it the cake as you like, right? Because the UK tried to do that, even after Brexit. So, I mean, we left, sorry about that, but, we still want the deal, to deal with other things as we like, towards you as the EU. That put the EU on a very heavy stress, right? Because the EU was for the first time facing one member leaving. One member saying, we are leaving. We are doing our own thing. So this politically was very, very tense. Very, very tense. There have been moments of extreme tension, especially in the beginning, right? When the UKIP people were so much dopamine, full of dopamine, they were like, weighing heavy on this. But importantly for you to remember, the fact that the UK has voted for a referendum to leave the EU means two things. It means that, again, the UK is a separate legal order from the EU, so nothing to do with the EU anymore, legally speaking. But, as the video says, EU law will keep applying to the UK, because the UK has already implemented most of EU law before leaving. And secondly, it means that some kind of agreement, some kind of deal had to be struck between the European Union and the UK. Just like the EU is doing now with Mercosur or with India or with whatever other country that we saw yesterday, with one additional hurdle, which is the proximity, which is the history. which is the fact that, of course, we are dealing with markets, societies, people, right, that used to be part of the European Union until the day before the referendum, let's say. So we have a lot of workers, people that will commute. Think about how many people will commute between the Netherlands, Belgium, Ireland. Think about Ireland, for God's sake. It's a full island split up in two, right? With all the history that comes with it. Maybe we'll touch upon this later. So this is the situation we're dealing with. So it's no obvious, it's no ordinary deal that must be negotiated here. And there are two deals that are going to be negotiated. One deal relates to the actual exit of the EU, the UK, I'm sorry, from the EU. And the other one is the follow-up, which is how to negotiate, regulate the relationship, the future relationship, especially the trade relationship. I will focus on that more, between the UK and the EU. All of this after the break. 15, okay? Okay. These folks take a seat, the show resumes. Please take a seat. Last warning. Are you with me? Okay. Are you alive? Are you awake? Okay, great. Good. So, we said the UK is out, okay? The UK is out, that's where we left our story, right? So now I have to figure out what happens next. And we said, two things happen. Essentially two kind of deals. One deal to kick them out, and one deal to keep them somehow in, essentially. So the first thing is to make sure that the UK is out for good. And legally speaking, this, of course, has a label on it, as a procedure on it, and this is explained here. How to kick out the UK from the EU, explained. It basically goes in 3 steps. And this is included in Article 50 of the Treaty of the European Union. Okay? This was a clause that nobody wanted to, put in place, but now they voted, so we need to get down to it. So basically it works in 3 steps. First of all, the state that wants to get out needs to send a letter to the European Council saying, look, we are leaving. Sorry. And that's what the UK did at some point. Then the European Council, which is the organization that includes only the head of states of the member states of the European Union. It's a very high-level organization. Only prime ministers, kings, not very often, or president of the republic, head of states are involved in this organization, which is part of the European Union. So the European Council then says, okay, we take note of your intention to leave, and then we give mandate to someone to start negotiations. Guess who is involved in negotiations? Who do you think should be involved in the negotiations? The Commission, yeah. Why the Commission? Well, first of all, because the Commission is not a member state, of course. It's not a council that represents member states. That would be politically charged. That would not end well, probably. So you need someone that is kind of neutral to it, that is technically skilled to do it. Okay? So that has people that are tough negotiators, that know what they're talking about, that can sit at the table with the Brits and discuss details, big shoulder people. So the Commission gets the mandate to negotiate the withdrawal, right? The exit, the so-called withdrawal of the UK from the European Union. Sorry, folks to the left, can you keep it quiet, please? Thanks. So negotiation starts between the EU and the UK. Then, once the negotiations are over, therefore, we have the final step, which is where the Council steps in again. This gets confusing a bit, but basically the agreement goes back to the Council, goes back to the Member States. The Council look at the agreement. They decide if the agreement is satisfactory. The same does the European Parliament. So also the Parliament checks out the agreement. They both, look into it. They see if they agree with it. Then eventually the Council, which is not the European Council, there are 2 different things. I have no idea who came up with this, but European Council and Council, there are 2 different things. The Council represents the member states at the ministry level. So they represent the Ministry, for example, of Agriculture, the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Defense, and so on and so forth. The European Council represents only the head of states. Okay? These are two different organizations. The Council, in this case, not the European Council, the Council looks at the agreement, agrees, realizes the agreement, it concludes the agreement with a certain level of majority. This is less important for us. Eventually, the last step is that all the member states, of course not the UK in this case, but all the member states have to ratify this agreement. Just like a trade agreement, a mixed agreement, as we discussed yesterday. So this is the step. Many people are involved. This is a very lengthy process. Of course, the negotiations are very tough, and the negotiation for the Brexit deal went around for years. Okay? But what happens as a consequence of this procedure? Essentially, once the withdrawal is official, so once the procedure is over, EU treaties, EU law stop being applied in the withdrawing country. Okay? As well as, and this is important, this is certainly something that the Brexit people did not tell to the voters. Also, all the international agreements that the EU has signed, including trade agreements, for example, that, as we know, is an exclusive competence of the EU, all the trade agreements, for example, they just don't apply anymore to the United Kingdom, to the withdrawing state. This means that the UK has to renegotiate stuff that has been negotiated and concluded by the EU for decades. Easy, right? Because, of course, not being member of the European Union anymore, this means that you're not part of the game anymore. Right? At the same time, another debunking of UKIP and Leave bullshit in the campaign, it's true that, of course, EU law will not be dumped on the UK Parliament anymore after Brexit, because the UK is not part of the EU anymore, but it is also true that before that, and until the end of the agreement, until the agreement is concluded, until its withdrawal is official, EU law will still be applied, and all the laws, the EU laws that have been implemented by the UK until the very end of the process will still apply in the UK, which means that the Parliament should have to pass new legislation to amend or to repeal, to get rid of all the EU law acts, including, the standards for sockets, the standards for jackets, the standards for whatever that the EU, all this kind of creepy stuff that the EU has put out there. And lastly, another point that certainly the Leave people have not mentioned to the voters, bye-bye EU money. Finito. Of course, you're not part of the EU anymore. You don't get money from the EU anymore, right? So, for example, in our little sphere, in the academic sphere, all the very brilliant Oxford and Cambridge colleagues, right? For many years, they have not been able to apply for European research fundings. And I would say it's fine. I mean, if you're not in the game, if you don't pay money, why the hell do you have to get, the money back? Sounds easy. They were pissed. I was like, democracy, baby. You decided. People have spoken, right? So, this is just an example. But there are, of course, many other sectors that have been impacted way more from this. Okay, so this is the procedure. Now, this is more or less the timeline of this procedure, especially the negotiation procedure. You can see that the notification came in 2017, March. The agreement was signed, concluded March 2019. So it was more or less 2 years of negotiations. 2 years. It's quite a long time. They will say the actual negotiating period is 18 months, but you can consider also the pre-negotiations, all the kind of petty stuff that happened before and after. 18 months of negotiations, very intense ones. Now, how did the negotiation look like? Look at the left side. Literally, this is how it looks like. You have a table, and you have two negotiating teams. Now, I wanna do a little game here. I want to see if you can recognize which team is which, if you look at the left-hand side. Who is the EU and who is the UK? Who is, in your opinion, on the left side?
Left is UK.
Wait, that's going to be messy. Let's do a hand raise. Who guesses for the EU on the left side? Okay. I assume the others go for the UK. Okay. Therefore, who assumes the UK is on the right side? Okay, so the EU is on the left side. The UK is on the right side. Now, can anybody of you notice any difference between the two teams?
Yes, there's two female on the left and there's some male.
That's a good difference. Yeah. No, there is one female in my opinion. Well, possibly. Okay. That is a good one, but it's not the one that I was looking for. Not the gender issue. Yes, they went digital, right? They went environmentally friendly. They did not print anything, right? The other guys came with tons of papers. They were bloody prepared. You know, they were tough negotiators. The UK people came with hands in their pockets. Okay, let's talk deal. That was the sort of sentiment across all the negotiations. UK was completely unprepared. They just sent people in. The EU people sent very tough negotiators. Because the UK thought, no, these EU people, you know, they're bureaucrats, they don't care, we're gonna play with them as we want. No, man, that's not how it works. The EU was very firm in dealing with this issue. And they follow through. And that's when the UK started to get very much worried, because they were like, okay, now this deal is serious. Now these EU people are not going to let us, you know, do our things. They're not going to let things pass. And that's where the discussion started between hard versus soft Brexit. So hard Brexit meaning essentially a full detachment of the UK from the EU, full detachment, just like, you know, becoming a third country, like Brazil again, like I don't know, like the United States, or a kind of soft version of this. So a version where still the UK will leave the EU, but with some different arrangements that will keep the two parts connected, because the UK realized, okay, maybe it's not a great deal for us to, you know, completely detach ourselves. We might end up with a bad deal. We might end up worse off, which ultimately is what happened for them. I have a video about this as well. Not of Donald Trump. Let's see. And then we will talk about the actual agreement in a nutshell. There we go. Because of course there were elections actually during the negotiations. I think Theresa May also had troubles, but that is not the point.
Election early in the first place was to strengthen her hand going into Brexit negotiations, and though it has done the exact opposite of that, tonight let's take a look at what those talks are going to involve, because talks are set to begin a week from tomorrow, and they need to be completed by March of 2019, which is not a lot of time to do something incredibly important and incredibly complicated.
Britain wants out of the EU, but we've been in for more than 40 years, with our countries, our systems becoming more and more tangled up with each other, more and more enmeshed, and we only have 2 years to hammer out a divorce deal.
It's true. This is going to be a messy, complicated divorce. And it's a rough analogy, but try and think of it this way. Imagine if Florida wanted to secede from the Union. Nice, right? But think about everything that would actually entail. Florida has a border with Alabama and Georgia that would potentially need patrolling. Any Florida goods going over that border, like oranges or meth, would likely be subject to tariffs, and then you'd need to decide whether Floridians would be welcome to live and work in the US or Americans welcome in Florida, and that's before you even get into the tricky question of who's forced to take custody of Hulk Hogan. The point is, Florida and the US splitting up would be an immensely complicated process. It's a great idea, and we should definitely do it, but it wouldn't be easy. And Brexit is going to be vastly more difficult and more expensive too. For a start, a so-called divorce bill needs to be negotiated, where the UK settles financial commitments that they made while a part of the EU. And some estimates put that as high as €100 billion. And that's just the beginning. Now, broadly speaking, the question is whether the UK will have a hard or a soft Brexit. And that is a concept that British TV has repeatedly attempted to explain, sometimes in the most ludicrous possible fashion.
The options range from a harder Brexit to a softer Brexit. And what better way to judge people's political tastes than through cheese? Hard or soft?
What? What better way to judge people's political taste than through cheese? I don't know, off the top of my head, literally all other ways. Even BuzzFeed would find "tell us what cheese you like and we'll tell you what Brexit you want" to be too stupid for one of their quizzes. And they've run the actual quizzes, "should you stick this up your butt?" and "which Olsen twin are you?" which is ridiculous because, as we addressed last week, there is only one Olsen twin. It's a gigantic conspiracy. You're being lied to. I just don't know why yet. But anyway, put that aside. That report actually had some useful information in it, if you can ignore the fact that it is pointlessly written on cheese.
A harder Brexit would see the UK leave the single market. The UK would then trade with the EU under World Trade Organization rules. We'd also have more of a say over our borders so we could control immigration. A softer Brexit would see the UK remain part of the single market. There'd be continued free access for EU nationals, but Britain's exports wouldn't be subject to border checks.
And that's actually a pretty decent explainer, although I really must insist that cheese is distractingly weird. Really, the only time cheese should be used as a framing device is if you are a mouse couple posing for wedding photos. And even then, it's a little Pinteresty. I'm just saying, it's never a bad idea to ask yourself, if you somehow couldn't Instagram your wedding, would you still be getting married? Anyway.
Okay, so cheese. I guess you got the main point here, regardless of the cheesy metaphor. The idea is, how do we deal with our trade relationships, especially how do we deal with our imports and exports moving forward? Do we go for like treating ourselves as completely weird strangers, or do we land somewhere else? Do we land somewhere where the UK still have access to the single market? Because it's of course something that the UK is interested in, right? Having free circulation of goods, free circulation of people, having all the freedoms that the EU market is grounded on. That was the discussion during the negotiations, mostly. The EU, I must say, was not really in favor of soft Brexit. The EU has always been quite tough and quite stark in its own positions. The UK has tried different tactics. In the end, I would say that a hard Brexit, a sort of softly hard Brexit, was a result of the negotiations. Again, 18 months, more or less, of negotiations. And out of the negotiations, what we have is essentially the so-called EU-UK withdrawal agreement, okay, which is a unicum. This is the première fois. This is the first time that we have this kind of agreement. Because, of course, it's the first time that anybody left the EU. So, it's a precedent. Essentially, what this agreement says is, or covers, is, of course, the status of EU-UK citizens, who can enter, who can leave the countries. I mean, the UK and the EU. Of course, bearing in mind that many people would work in the UK, or many UK people would work in the EU at the moment of Brexit. The UK financial commitments to the EU, should the UK keep paying stuff to the EU? Should the UK get money back from the EU? Should the UK give more money to the EU? All this kind of stuff that was painful. We mentioned in the video 100 billion pounds, I think, around that. And the most contentious political issue, which was the Northern Ireland issue. I mean, Northern Ireland is a whole story. Anybody from Northern Ireland? Or from Ireland? Okay, so maybe you can tell this story better than I do. It's not a nice story. Northern Ireland, I mean, coming here to get a bit in the mood, I was listening to U2. You know why I was listening to U2? Because U2 have this song, which is called Sunday Bloody Sunday. I don't know if you've heard of it. Have you heard of it? Yeah. What is Sunday Bloody Sunday about? You don't read the lyrics? Okay, but there's someone out there. Yeah, maybe. Yes, 1972. It's about a massacre by the UK military forces against protesters in Northern Ireland, in Derry, or Londonderry, because again, people will call it different names depending on who you're faithful to, who you are or also your religion as well, it's a complicated story. Again, I don't enter into that story. But just to say that Northern Ireland has always been a very heavy politically charged, and more than politically, unfortunately, issue in the UK. And Northern Ireland was not necessarily super in favor of, I mean, two issues here. Northern Ireland was not, as we saw, fully in favor of leaving. And second, Northern Ireland is the entry point, the closest entry point to the EU, because the rest of Ireland is EU, right? The Republic of Ireland is EU territory. Plus, add to this that on most of the areas between the Northern Ireland and Ireland, we don't have really borders. There's no really border checks. So how do we deal with all this? That was also subject to the agreement, and we had especially a specific, therefore a specific protocol dealing with that. Then there was a whole governance set up in place to sort of operationalize and make the agreement work. We have now a EU-UK joint committee, all tons of committees. I think I have a slide about that. And also, we have a dispute settlement mechanism. So we have a court. We have an arbitration court that takes care of all the possible issues that arise in the implementation of the agreement. We have actually a case that happened lately between UK and the EU, because again, the UK is not part of the EU anymore. So we need to find a way also to settle disputes. Disputes might arise, you know, neighbors not always go along very well. The idea is that this agreement could be renegotiated, so they leave a sort of small door open to renegotiation, but maybe. The EU didn't really want to reopen this file after 18 months of negotiations and all that. This slide is just to show you a bit of numbers. Again, it's boring, so I can skip through it. You can check it out yourself. But just to say that the, let's say, the amount of trade, of course, that was the major point of contention in the withdrawal agreement, is not marginal, not negligible. If you look at the statistics of the UK trade with the EU, I mean, the UK is around 14.4% of exports from the EU. If you think about it, US is, or was, now I have to check the latest stats, but the US is 18%. So we're talking about essentially one of the major trading parties of the European Union. That was the other big deal that was to be decided. And this is where the hard versus soft Brexit discussion came about. So we're talking about, you know, civil rights, political rights, but also about money and market. So what was the understanding there? Essentially, the understanding was that we had different options. The EU has also adopted, by the way, different kind of positions during the negotiations. The UK had different positions during the negotiations, as I said. In this slide, you see essentially different regimes that the EU has in place towards different states that are neighboring states. Okay? So for example, here we have the so-called EFTA states or EEA states that are Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. Very rich country, Liechtenstein, very interesting country. Well, you see, for example, that, you know, with Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, actually, there is no free movement of goods, really. For example, there is no jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the European Union over those countries. But if you go to Norway, as a EU citizen, you're not going to be asked a passport, right? Are you? Last time I went, they didn't check my passport. Why? Because we have a whole different arrangement for circulation of people. Switzerland, again, another option. No free movement there. No financial contribution to the EU. Regulatory autonomy, they regulate as they want. They don't apply EU law. They are neutral by definition, of course. Ukraine, okay, challenging example to bring, but still, before the war, but even during the war, I would say. Still autonomous, still separate from the EU, still no jurisdiction of the Court of Justice of the EU over there. And Turkey, which is also a neighboring country, which gets all of that you see before, plus a separate independent trade policy by the EU. These are the neighbors. This is how the EU engages with the neighbors. The UK is seen as a neighbor. Then you have all the rest of the world with which, as we saw yesterday, the EU basically does free trade agreements. Okay? So these are the options. These were the sort of range. This was a range of options that the EU had and the UK had to, let's say, come up with a formula. Ultimately, I would say we landed there, somewhere here. So we landed in a situation where the EU recognized, of course, autonomy to regulate to the UK. You can regulate as you want. No really free movement of goods by default. Specific agreement for the circulation of people and workers. But when it comes to trade, we need to negotiate an agreement separately. No way that the UK will be part of the internal market. No way that you get all the benefits of the internal market. I'm sorry. You left. You live with it. So that was the final landing point of the agreement. You have a whole timeline here if you want to entertain yourself with this. What I want to point out here, however, as you can see, from 25th of February 2020, great timing, COVID time, I think by the day, COVID day, the Council mandated the negotiation for the EU-UK partnership. So we said March 2019, I think, the withdrawal agreement is kind of concluded. We have an agreement. This is how we part ways. This is how we divorce. Then, less than a year later, the Council said, look, now you see what comes next. Now we negotiate what comes next. We negotiate a partnership agreement. We negotiate how we are going to deal with ourselves in the future. Okay? You still with me? Not sure. Okay, let's see. In any case, this led to a new agreement, which is the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Okay? The EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement. They put a different label on it, but it's basically a trade agreement. It's basically a free trade agreement. As you can see from the goal of the agreement. The goal of the agreement is clear. Make sure that there are no tariffs, no fees, no charges, no quantitative restrictions, words that the EU bureaucrats love so much. Quantitative restrictions on trade between the parties. No restriction to trade. It is different than saying the UK is part of the single market. It is different. It is different. One thing is to say that it's free trade. One thing is to say you want to sell me your cheddar cheese. You are not going to pay custom duties. You're not going to pay tariffs on it. Another thing is to say you are part of a unique single market where your products will circulate freely, right? With all the rights, the duties, the freedoms that come with it. Forget about that. It's only about not putting barriers on your imports and exports. Of course, mutually, also because the EU is exporting feta to the UK, right? I fixed with feta this week. I don't know why. In any case, this is what the agreement is essentially about. Now, I want to stress a bit the narrative around this agreement. I'm not going to bother you with all the nitty-gritty details. I'm going to give you a couple of snapshots, but I want to stress the narrative around it. The UK built the narrative that this agreement is a friendly cooperation between sovereign equals. Like the UK is a sovereign state, the EU is a sovereign something, is an entity, and we negotiate as equals. This was the sort of mindset with which the UK entered into the negotiations of this agreement, which meant that since we are sovereign, just like the EU, no matter which agreement we get, we have to keep our autonomy as a sovereign state that legislates, that takes decisions on our own behalf. And therefore, we are not going to integrate in the EU by this agreement. It's a kind of negative integration. We integrate by removing barriers. It's something else than being some sort of 27 plus 1 member state of the EU. We are not a 27 plus 1 member state of the EU. We are just a state, an aggregation of state, whatever the UK is, that is negotiating means of, to remove barriers with the EU as sovereign countries. And this is the narrative of the EU, the UK. On this other side, we have the EU. And again, Commission likes stuff, words, buzzwords like level playing field. They like this kind of stuff. So the narrative that the EU pushed in the negotiations of this partnership agreement, trade and cooperation agreement, is we need to ensure that, you know, we are all on the same level, that nobody's cheating here, right? Because the UK is a big market, the EU is a big market, the UK as industry or financial sectors has got what they got, the EU the same. We need to make sure that everyone is on the same page, right? There is no cheating, no distortion of the market, no dumping on prices, no weird stuff here. So this is what the EU wanted. And the EU got it, I think, especially in certain fields that I put here, especially on labor and social rights, on environmental protection, climate action, on these things that the EU at the time considered very important. The Commission, the first von der Leyen Commission that was in charge back then, they considered it very important, thinking of the European Green Deal, that is gone now, but back then was important. The European Union was very keen on ensuring that, you know, just because of your leaving, just because we are just because we are divorced, you are not going to, mess up with environmental standards or social rights standards or labor standards just because you want to do it. Because this is more or less the purpose also for the other free trade agreements, just to make sure that standards are kept equal. And then, of course, the whole governance of this, and adjudication mechanism that come with it. This is a snapshot of how the governance of the trade and cooperation agreement works. I'm not going to go through this, but just to give you the complexity of this. This is how the trade relationships are governed between the UK and the EU according to the current agreement that we have. It's kind of a mess. It's like, how many? 10, 15 specialized committees on different things. This is what the withdrawal to the EU from the EU looks like. Complexity. Okay? The UK didn't know this, of course. But they knew it, but they just didn't really put it on the headlight. This is how complex this is, right? Negotiating and concluding a governance structure that makes trade relationships functional. And of course, this is only the committee side of it. So people that gather together and deal with nitty-gritty issues. Another part of the governance, interesting one, was this kind of joint assembly between the UK and the EU parliamentary bodies. Because, of course, all the members of the European Parliament of the UK were gone. They were not part of the European Parliament anymore. Rightfully so. So we needed to find a space where representatives of the European Parliament or representatives of the UK Parliament would somehow discuss things together. That's also a consequence of this agreement. And from the perspective of adjudication, so dispute settlement, disputes, we have an arbitration tribunal that I think recently handed over the first decision, one of the first decisions, against the UK. And in this case, there was an issue on the prohibition of fishing of sand eel. Fishing, obviously, fishery is a big deal because, the sea is shared, fisheries are shared, boats are going in and out. Are you fishing in my territory? Which territory are you fishing? Can you fish this stuff? I prohibit you from fishing this stuff in the UK sea. Aha, nice. Okay, I'm going to take you to court. This is against our trade agreement. This kind of stuff. This was the first case that was launched in arbitration. So there was tension. There is tension, of course, because, there always is. We have 10 minutes left, which is great. I don't want to go too much into details about this. I just want to tell you that, indeed, we have this agreement in place. The slide is a bit self-explanatory. It got all the information you need. Definitely important to notice that this is a complex agreement that covers a lot of stuff. It's probably one of the most extensive trade agreements that the EU has negotiated and concluded so far, especially and precisely because of the nature of the other parties negotiating. As I mentioned already, as I mentioned already, it also includes specific provisions on judicial cooperation, law enforcement, adjudication. I had some snapshot for you from the agreement, just to give you the size of how a treaty provision looks like, and also what is the spirit of this agreement. As you can see, Article 1 purpose, the purpose of the agreement is to make sure that prosperity, good neighborliness, actually, that's the word for it, characterized by close and peaceful relations based on cooperation, respectful of parties' autonomy and sovereignty. This is the first provision of the agreement. This is a provision that says what this agreement is for. Why do we have this agreement? This is how the law works. Normally, at the very beginning of any law, you put a provision that specifies why do you have this law? Why is this law existing? What is the purpose? And this is the case for the trade agreement. I think it's a very important provision to look like if we think about how the UK and the EU have sort of fixed their relationships. Cooperation, respect, peaceful relations, but with autonomy and sovereignty. This is a kind of, I think this is a kind of a mid-ground between the two negotiating positions of the UK and the EU in the first place. Okay? This is an interesting one. Well, that's more technical one. We can skip this one. This is also interesting for 1 minute, probably, because this is what I was talking to you about in terms of the EU wanting to get a level playing field, so to making sure that this agreement is not providing losers, especially on the EU side, and this is the technique that they use. So this is a provision of the treaty that says that essentially, well, of course, the UK and the EU respect democracy and respect the rule of law, respect the protection of fundamental rights, right, including the European Convention on Human Rights. And this agreement, according to this agreement, neither the EU nor the UK should somehow undermine these freedoms and these rights. So basically, the UK and the EU commit themselves to protect fundamental rights. And this is not a given, by the way, because the UK has been often very skeptical about the European Convention of Human Rights. Because they say, oh, we have the Bill of Rights, which is like, how many? 500 years of age. We don't need this stuff from, from the Council of Europe. We know how to deal with human rights. Okay. But the EU, who is neither a party to the European Convention on Human Rights, by the way, the EU has not ratified the European Convention on Human Rights, they still respect it. This is, again, material if you want to enroll in the EU law major. You will hear this stuff from me and other people. They both, however, commit to respect fundamental rights. And they do the same for workers' rights, social rights, environmental protection, digital rights, stuff like that. It's all in the agreement. You can have fun with it, skim it with it, screw it as you like. Okay. We are close to the end. One last reflection, because I see you're tired. I'm tired too. The last reflection would be circling back to the topic of our conversation, the sort of red thread, integration versus disintegration. Based on all the facts and all the information that we had, that we discussed here, can we actually say that Brexit ultimately disintegrated the EU or not? Or further integrated the EU? Yep. Okay, I'm repeating for the people at home here that are listening and for the others. Essentially, your colleague, your name, sir? Ivan. Ivan is saying that the Brexit actually did not disintegrate EU. If anything, it actually strengthened and further politically integrated the EU because, I mean, of course, the threat of and the fear, I think I'm quoting here, the fear of a member state leaving and, destabilizing the system led to a more coherent, much stronger, and more coordinated action by the EU. Is this what you meant? Okay. Anybody agrees or disagrees with this? Yeah, from Northern Ireland, yeah.
Brexit, it did create sort of like some, I guess, political imbalances, but other than that, I agree with what Ivan said.
Agreement, okay, agreement. Any disagreement? Any disagreement? Ivan is always right, okay. I would say that's certainly some truth to that. I mean, the response, the Brexit was seen as a crisis. And certainly, I would say, people say the EU, the European project, has been forged in crisis. If you can look throughout the history of the European integration, many of the changing points, the turning points were crisis. And if you look from 2016 to 2026, we have symptoms of crisis. Like the Brexit crisis, the financial crisis, then the Brexit crisis. No, before the Brexit, the immigration crisis. Then we had the Brexit crisis. Then we had the COVID crisis. Then we had the Ukraine crisis, the energy crisis. I mean, all this kind of stuff. Bad stuff to live in, but ultimately, I would argue, all of them incrementally have led to further political cohesion. I wouldn't call it integration. Probably integration is pushing it too far. But I would say more cohesion, political cohesion. Right? It's very good. I think it's very good that the EU has been tough on the UK. It's very good that the EU has been quite strong, quite stark in its negotiating position. That's my opinion. Because that prevented political spillovers. That prevented, sort of cracks where other forces that were leading, of course, in other countries, that were fueling for French exit, Italy exit, Dutch exit, whatever you call it, we managed to put some water onto that fire. Okay, whether you like it or not. I mean, maybe politically you can be very happy with your country leaving the EU. I'm not blaming you and judging you for that. I'm just saying you're going to be in deep shit if you do it. As simple as that. In any case, what happened was that definitely the UK has not, and the Brexit has not disintegrated the EU. If anything, probably it's made it a bit more cohesive. What happened was definitely that the UK became an awkward partner in the European integration, okay? Not the awkward partner, but one of the most awkward partners. It was awkward before already, as we've seen in the very first video I showed you. It has always been awkward, but of course now it has become even more awkward. However, UK awkwardness, in that sense, has been bypassed. And this is good. However, we always have to remember that many other states have the possibility to become awkward. What happened in the UK, nobody could see it. Nobody could see that coming, including Mr. Cameron. That's why he called a referendum. It was like, this time, forget about these Brexit people. He got what he deserved. We have to see these things coming. We have to be careful because, of course, nothing is a given. Nothing is a given. Politically, economically, things can change very rapidly. That kind of winds have been blown out, I think. But we live in a moment right now where, of course, we are all aware that extreme forces are operating and are in power in many member states. Maybe these kind of moves are not high up in the agenda, but they are still there. And again, democracy will always prevail, hopefully, until we have democracy. But again, I don't think it's a good deal for anybody. And with this, I would say that's all, folks. I will see you maybe around. Thank you for listening to this crap of mine. If you have any questions on this stuff, please do reach out. There should be some very funny midterm questions for you about this stuff. So have fun with them. Okay? Cheers.